Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. This session is really focused on how we can tell the difference between what's good in the kind of climate solution space and what we're calling what's the BS factor. So very hard for some people who may be new to the space to know how to decipher from an investment point of view, but just in general, what's really working and what's not. So we have some excellent people with us today who can help us kind of navigate a bit through this. Professor Michael Mann, who's got an amazing new book out, The New Climate Wars, is very much focused on some of this. The very kind and wonderful Vanessa, I hope I say this properly, Vanessa Fajans-Turner, who's working with Bank Forward, and John Hale at Morningstar. And my name is Blair Palese, and I am climate editor at Climate and Capital Media. So maybe, Vanessa, we could start with you, just a quick take on why you think it's so important right now to help people kind of navigate, given there's a lot of money flowing into climate and climate solutions.
Well, thanks so much for having me. What we see right now is that the world knows what it has to do in terms of slowing the pipeline of finance to fossil fuels. And we know also that major big banks are funneling more and more money into fossil fuels with increase year on year since the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. We're going the wrong direction. What I really urge people to think about is that for whatever investment fund, whatever investment advisor they're working with, they ask where the non-impact investment dollars are going with that institution, and they think about how their funds will be used in that institution when they are not being allocated to their impact funds.
Great, thank you so much. Michael, what do you think is maybe the biggest challenge and problem when so much effort and spin is going into kind of creating, in some cases, an image that it's a good thing for the climate, but in fact, it's the same old fossil fuel rhetoric?
Yeah, this is what I call the new climate war in my new book. Climate change denial is no longer tenable. It just nobody buys it because people can feel, they can see the impacts of climate change. But the forces of inaction, I call them the inactivists in the book, are still trying to keep us addicted to fossil fuels because they continue to profit for as long as we remain on fossil fuels. And so they're doing everything they can to distract us by proposing false solutions like geoengineering or carbon capture, and to thwart efforts to decarbonize our economy by discrediting renewable energy, by deflecting attention away from the needed policy solutions to individual behavior, as if it's just a matter of us as individuals. Of course, we need to do everything we can ourselves to minimize our carbon footprint, to minimize our environmental footprint, but we need our policymakers to put in place incentives that will shift the entire economy away from fossil fuels towards climate-friendly renewable energy.
John, from your perspective, there's loads of great opportunities that are coming out. I think more funds, more focus on investment in innovation and new tech. That's great. How do you find people in the actual market of looking at the investment side? How are they working out how best to navigate that and make good choices?
Given how much the climate crisis has worsened over the past decade and the point it's at today, you might think that all mutual funds and ETFs have taken steps to protect their investors from the effects of climate change. After all, they have collectively trillions of dollars at stake, but sadly, that's not the case. Standard index funds and most traditional actively managed funds have not even really taken even the most rudimentary steps to address climate risk in their portfolios. So, luckily for investors in the US, there are now close to 400 open-end and exchange-traded funds out there from which to choose that do focus in some way on climate and other environmental, social, and corporate governance, ESG, risks and opportunities. But even within that group, only a small subset are completely fossil fuel free, for example, and a relatively few number really actively focus on investing only in companies that are creating products and services that'll positively impact the transition to a net zero economy. So you really have to look under the hood before selecting, even a fund that says it's focused on climate.
Well, this is just a short taste, and we'll have more time for kind of diving into some of the detail on the session. So hope to see everybody there. And thanks so much, all of you, for your expertise. Look forward to talking more when we can. We've got a great group of people today and a really great topic, which is how in this wave of information do we separate the good and the opportunities that make sense versus the BS, the rhetoric and the greenwash that's out in the world in this space, quite a lot of it. I just introduced our fantastic guests. Vanessa Fagans-Turner runs the amazing Bank Forward, which is really working hard to kind of get banks moving a lot faster. Author and scientist Michael Mann, who has a new book out called The New Climate War, really helps to navigate this issue of what's motivating the kind of anti-climate action things we see happening in the world. And John Hale, who at Morningstar, who I think, John, really impressive take on the challenge ahead, I think, and the role that maybe financiers, the financial sector can play. So yeah, just kick it off, I guess, with one question, which is, given the kind of rhetoric we've got floating around, how do people navigate that? Maybe the three of you could give a couple of great tips and ideas for how you find your way through the kind of information flood that's out there, and advice for people kind of trying to approach it and understand what's going on. Do you want to start, Vanessa?
Great. First of all, thanks for having me, Blair, and it's been a really exciting moment to be able to talk about this issue, because you'll probably, if you're looking at anything to do with sustainable finance, there's a lot of news right now and a lot being said about the finance community becoming more and more sustainable. One of the things that I spend my days doing is digging into what that means for a lot of these banks. And not everybody has time to do that, but I spend time looking at where they actually put their financing behind the scenes and compare their total sustainable finance portfolios with their total financing fossil fuel portfolios. And you'll see things like JP Morgan says that it has the largest sustainable finance portfolio in the world. And that's true. It also has the largest fossil fuel financing portfolio in the world. And guess what? It's much bigger than its sustainable finance portfolio. So a big thing to do is to compare your totals on that side and look at where the money is going in inventory.
Michael, you've got a lot of tips in your book, but maybe a few top lines that people can think about when they approach climate change.
Yeah, I guess the first is finding trusted voices, because there is so much misinformation and disinformation out there, much of it promoted by fossil fuel interests and bad petrostate actors who flood our social media feeds with bots and trolls promoting misinformation, and not just on the basic science, but on the solutions. And that's a really important point here, because we've largely moved beyond outright climate change denialism, because it just isn't credible anymore. People can see that climate change is happening. But the forces of misinformation, the forces of inaction, I call them the inactivists in my book, fossil fuel interests and those promoting their agenda, still bombard us with misinformation when it comes to the urgency and the solutions that are available, or even promoting doom and despair to lead us down a path of inaction. So I like to, look at sort of opinion leaders, say on social media. If you're on Twitter, for example, you might say, well, who is Bill McKibben? Who are Greta Thunberg and Bill McKibben tweeting? Who do they follow? Katharine Hayhoe, Gavin Schmidt. These are other scientist colleagues of mine who are scientists, but they're also communicators. And you can be sure that they will be promoting useful information about the science, about the impacts, and about the solutions. I like to include myself in that group as well. And I'm Michael E. Mann at Twitter. But, if you are looking to rebut some talking point that you've heard from your uncle at Thanksgiving, there's a great website called Skeptical Science that has a list of all of the climate denial myths and what the actual science has to say. And you can tweet, you can email links to people. You can access it on your iPhone, so you can debunk your uncle in real time at Thanksgiving. No, Uncle Joe, that's actually number 3 on the Skeptical Science list. The planet is warming, and recent years have been the warmest on record. You get the idea. So look for those trusted voices, whether it's on social media or websites like Skeptical Science, or basic science websites, scientific societies like AAAS. Sciline, which is sponsored by AAAS, is great. They provide sort of brief summaries of the hot topics in climate science, and it has the imprimatur of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, but it's written in a way that's accessible to people who don't have a scientific background.
That's great to know. Hey, John, you might have similar ideas for where people can find good financial information in this space. Have you got some tips you give us for what you watch and where you find the best information?
Yeah, well, I think, it's keeping with what Professor Mann just was talking about. I mean, in the financial world, there's a lot of inactivism going on, there, especially when some of the larger, the giant asset managers, global asset managers, many of them have, some sort of initiative going on. They're getting more and more concerned about climate risk, for instance, in their portfolios. But they're also kind of trying to send a message to all investors out there. Hey, we consider ESG, environmental social governance issues. We're doing some of that. So rest easy. And I think the other side of the coin there is that, and the other thing, I guess, to add to that is on the performance side, they're sort of saying, you may not want to risk investing in a more sustainable way or more climate aware way, or focus on ESG and those sorts of things, because you might have a performance issue, and you're really trying to keep people from taking steps in this direction. Whereas on the other hand, we have more options than ever, and there are issues with how to navigate the now 400 plus sustainable funds we have in the U.S., because they do take a range of approaches. But you have those choices out there, and some of the asset managers that have been really in this space for a long time, going back even before going back to the 20th century, that I think are the most trusted experts in this area. And if you want to really find out, what is if I were going to invest in a sustainable fund, what are the traits it should have? What are the elements of it? And go to some of those experts, the Calverts, the Pax, companies that have been in this space for a long time.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I guess too, when you think about sort of where and how money's moving, because it's moving very fast. Three things that we talked about in the keynote were the upcoming COP and what that means globally, the speed of money being invested in the US on climate and infrastructure, and how fast Asia is moving. Given those trends, I think maybe a question for all of you is, that's kind of big picture stuff, but what does it mean to people trying to navigate technology or ideas of investment that might be coming ahead? Maybe what's on the ground right now that you think is solid, and where you think good trends are heading for the hope of speeding up that reduction of carbon, but into the new technologies, innovations we need. Michael, do you have a couple of favorites? Obviously right now renewables are already here, operating, great investment, but there's also EVs and batteries, and maybe any take from the three of you on how to think about that sort of progression and where the opportunities are and how to think about it.
Sure. Did you want me to start out?
Yeah, great. And we'll go around.
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, and so I'm interested to hear what the other panelists have to say about this. But we do have the solution. We don't need a miracle, Bill Gates, who has said, that we need a miracle to solve this problem. We don't. We have the solution. It exists. It's renewable energy. It's wind. It's solar. It's geothermal. We've seen it. South Australia is a great success story. And, there are people who are making a whole lot of money by investing in clean energy technology, because that's the wave of the future. So, yeah, we should continue to invest in new technology, efforts to sort of, produce more efficient wind turbines and solar panels. That's all important. But to me, the real challenge is the scaling up, is the deployment of existing technology. And so I would be looking at the startups who are, have boots on the ground and are actually out there deploying renewable energy, especially at a time when we've got an administration that's coming in, that has come in, the Biden administration, that is providing incentives for renewable energy. So that's going to be a burgeoning market. We're going to see, more support for renewables, hopefully a price on carbon of some sort. So this is just a great time you can actually make money and do what's right for the environment at the same time. Isn't that wonderful?
Absolutely. Vanessa, what is, looking at the banks, I guess, one question I have it seems like great opportunities for them, but many of them are really slow moving. Why do you think that is? Are there obstacles to getting those bigger monolithic institutions to move more quickly? Vanessa, I think you're muted. Can we unmute Vanessa?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Good.
So there certainly are barriers, but not nearly as many as the banks would lead you to believe. There are contracts that some banks might have in place with companies that are conducting unsustainable business that might go for 10 years. It's actually one of the very important reasons that we have to tell our banks that we want them to stop expanding fossil fuel financing, meaning they should stop financing new fossil fuel projects, because those projects won't start to make money for several years, making it very hard for the bank to pull out. And then that means that when the projects come online, you've locked in emissions in the future that were not there before. But there are mostly banks have been slow to adopt the sustainable finance options because they're looking for things at huge scale rather than doing the work of identifying opportunities that are either individual or that are not part of larger funds. And that means that they're really, or they're looking for very long track records. That means that there are many things that don't qualify that would otherwise still be very important. In addition, they're not looking at some of the policy space. They're continuing to invest in fossil fuels, for example, without identifying or recognizing that Europe has rules in place to say that electric vehicles must replace fossil fuel using vehicles by 2030, which will vastly affect the consumption of fossil fuels, et cetera. And just before we hand off to John, who's really the expert in this space, not me, but I'll always put on another cap for a wonderful organization I work with called Investable Oceans, which really looks at the blue economy as a really untapped area of opportunity with billions of dollars in potential for investment in sustainable alternatives to the things we know we have to do, shipping, fishing, et cetera.
That's a great topic that doesn't come up often in the climate space, but there's such an intersection, I think, of these kind of areas of blue economy, sustainably done, plus climate. John, you're the expert. I'd love to hear what your take is for those on our session that might be new to navigating it, but your experience would be great to hear about.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we'll probably get into maybe at some point in the discussion, a lot of options out there for investors in public markets investing, equity, fixed income, are sort of broad-based portfolios that focus on kind of evaluating companies based on some set of I guess I would call them sustainability concerns, broadly speaking, and there's less of a focus than you might think, and I think this creates some disappointment initially amongst investors. There's less focus around what I would call, I guess, sustainability themes and climate themes, where you're really trying to focus on companies that have, products and services that are going to be, that are going to contribute to the creation of a net zero economy. But there's a lot of interest from investors out there. That idea really resonates with investors, and so we're starting to see more focus among asset managers on how to create those kinds of portfolios so that we can really drive investment more towards this idea of sustainable products, sustainable solutions. And it goes beyond renewable energy. I mean, renewable energy is a key component of that, but to all kinds of clean tech type applications. It's coming into play in the municipal bond market with infrastructure needs, and just being able to understand the kinds of risks that different locales have, issuers have, based on climate risk. So we're starting to get to that point. The other thing that we've seen historically with renewable energy in particular is that there's kind of a boom and bust cycle with those sorts of stocks. There has been historically. It'll be very interesting to see. Of course, they all, garnered huge gains last year. But as the future becomes more clear on, what's going to happen with renewable energy, and as it becomes, more of a developed industry, then I think the volatility of the investments will reduce and see a more long-term growth prospect. And it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing, but I think investors will be able to get behind it more when it has those kinds of longer-term growth characteristics rather than up and down cycles.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. I think it's such a different mindset, isn't it? Some of the kinds of solutions that we're looking at, they tend not to be big, giant, coal plants, coal power stations, for instance, versus distributed renewables or, fit for purpose solutions. So I guess it'd be useful to hear your thoughts a little bit around the kind of language. I think it's something Michael talks about a lot in the book. The kind of language that's been used, natural gas, it sounds so nice, how we start to call things what they really are, and how that can help people both understand them in the public, but, in terms of investment and money, really determining what's a good climate solution, which is great, which is maybe a potential one, and maybe what is, fiction, if you will, things that might happen one day. But most likely, carbon capture and storage, how many years have we been throwing lots of money at it? There's not really a good example of that up and running on any scale in the world. But if you'd read the industry, mostly fossil fuel companies talking about it, you'd be, forgiven for thinking, hey, this is going to be really important in the future. It'd be great to hear from you three how when you read stuff like that, how do you think back to determine whether it can be a good thing or a bad thing, or is it motivated by stalling, if you will, to try and keep fossil fuels in the game as long as they can? John, do you want to start on that one?
Well, it wasn't so long ago where when you talk to fund managers about their fossil fuel exposure, where that's always what you would hear is that, well, natural gas, that's different. That's natural gas in regards to transition fuel, et cetera, et cetera. And they're taking advantage of the stocks during the fracking boom and everything else. So it's always, I think, a little bit disingenuous, but positively, we're not hearing that as much anymore. I think a lot of asset managers understand that the carbon risks of natural gas are greater than we thought even a few years ago with methane leakage and all that. And so we are seeing that. But I think it's an important distinction to make when you're looking for a fund that is dealing with climate risk in some way or purporting to do so, is what's its view on fossil fuels? Not that many of them are completely fossil fuel free. And quite a few of them are, coal free. They're not investing in coal plants anymore, but they're willing to invest in some cases in natural gas. A lot of them are still willing to invest in, in the supply chain and that sort of thing, not production. So I think that's an important thing to look for, and you do find distinctions there, but you can't assume everybody's, just because it's a sustainable fund or a climate aware fund, that it's absolutely fossil fuel free.
Absolutely. Michael, give us your take on the language.
Yeah, this is certainly a thrust of the new climate war. This is one of the tactics, is to sound like you're talking about climate solutions, to talk a good game when in fact what you're proposing is more of the same. It's business as usual, and it takes us down the wrong path. And even Bill Gates, who, I applaud him. He has a new book out about climate change. He's using his platform to draw attention to the climate crisis. That's great. But even his prescription, I think, is rather risky. He sort of downplays the role that renewable energy can play in getting us where we need to go. And there's solid literature now, numerous studies by experts that demonstrate we can get 80% of the way there, 80% of our energy from renewables by 2030, 100% by 2050. We can get there on renewables. So that means we don't need these riskier options that people like Bill Gates talk up, and that includes, the idea of natural gas as a transition fuel, as if a fossil fuel can be the solution to a problem created by fossil fuels. It can't. Natural gas isn't a bridge to a fossil fuel-free future. It's a bridge to nowhere, and we have to understand that. It takes us down the wrong path at a time when we've got to be moving dramatically off of fossil fuels. Geoengineering, again, is sort of a cover-up solution. We put particles into the stratosphere. We shoot particles into the stratosphere to block out some of the incoming sunlight to try to offset the warming. What could possibly go wrong, right? I mean, there are huge unintended potential consequences with these schemes, but what they all serve, if you're the fossil fuel interests who can no longer deny climate change, then at least maybe you can delay the transition. And a great way to do that is to kick the can down the road, as you allude to. Say, well, look, we're going to be able to do capture and sequestration in a decade. We're going to be able to fix this problem with technology 10 years from now. Trust us. And in the meantime, so let us continue to burn those fossil fuels. It's a crutch. It's a way to prevent us from taking the dramatic action that we really need to take now to solve this problem at its source, which is getting off of fossil fuels.
Yeah, Vanessa, a follow on a little bit from that is, do you see, because you watch the banking and the investment space closely, people who are cutting through with the language and actually doing the good, the better side, which is to interpret, these are good investments right now. They are a solution and they have good returns. Who do you see kind of, showing how it's done, I guess?
This is a great question, and it's really an important one because so many people use the terminology wrongly. There are organizations and funds and financial firms that take this seriously, and generally I commend those that usually start with a fossil fuel-free platform. That is a really great place to start, and there are people who pioneered this approach over 10 years ago, like Jeff Skoll with his fund Capricorn LLC, which is a fossil fuel-free fund, one of the earlier ones, and has a very good year last year because of its minimal exposure, and invests in renewable energy consistently. So there are certainly a number of different groups of varying sizes that have taken this on, and they are growing. Of course, there are places like Generation, which were started by figures like Al Gore, which have taken this also as a premise, as initially was seen as an experiment. We needed a track record, and are now going further. There are groups like Closed Loop, which is a wonderful group I really appreciate, yes, which looks not only at investments that are fossil fuel free, but it really tries to identify investments that look at their entire supply chain, that look at sort of initial production to use case and end of life is the terminology they use for what happens to this item at the end. Can it be recycled? Can it disintegrate? So there are a lot of great ways to look at it. But if I can just jump in quickly to the language conversation as well, because this is something I like to talk about. The phrase net zero is getting used a great deal. And one of the real dangers of a concept like this is net means that you're counterbalancing. And really what we need, this is where banks and fossil fuel companies can say, we will counterbalance, we will continue as usual, and we will counterbalance, offset our emissions by planting more trees or by geoengineering. And scientifically, practically, time-wise, this is not a solution for this. And it's really something we have to hold our leaders and our businesses accountable for. Similarly, for those businesses that say that they are net zero operationally is a very different scope of impact than a broader extension of a company in a broader reach. That means that they're not that they are maintaining and conserving energy through their windows and their light use. But banks in particular have something called Scope 3 emissions. We also don't make it easy on ourselves by having lots of terminology and jargon. Scope 3 emission for banks means, what do they fund? And what's the impact of the companies banks fund? That's the fossil fuel companies and the car companies. So it's always something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think scope 3 is a good one to pick on because most people maybe have never heard of it, wouldn't mean much to them. But here in Australia, we're the largest exporter of coal and LNG. Scope 3, we have no plan to roll back our export of fossil fuels. And there's no federal plan for that, no talking to companies about the need to do that. And until that accounting of scope 3, those emissions of, in this case, you sell and then it goes offshore, potentially you export it out. Somebody else has to account for it down the track. It's that real kicking the can that Michael's talking about. We have to start, thinking about how we work that back up and put the responsibility on those who are, making the profit from it. But I think that terminology question is a good one. Offsets, man, you can drive a truck through that, right? How is it? Is it good? Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's really not good. Do we have enough to make a difference on climate? I'd love to hear your three take on offsets as a concept, because it may be necessary in the short term to help some transition completely out of fossil fuels. But if, I think as Michael said, you just keep using that as your excuse for inaction, then it's not a solution. It needs to be called. John, in your looking at investment funds, and in particular, I guess the kind of thinking in the investment world, how do they think about offsets, and how do you think about it in terms of a good sign or a bad sign when you're looking at a company or a particular innovation?
Well, I think the focus really has to be on, particularly for companies that have discernible material climate or carbon risk in terms of their emissions, scope 1 through 3. I mean, you really need a plan for how that's going to be brought down and in line with the Paris Accords. It's really not about offsets really at all, unless it's kind of a transition strategy, right? We're going to start dealing with offsets, but mainly I think the focus has to be, and I think financial analysts are going to, I think they recognize this, particularly when a company has material financial risk at stake here in the transition to a low carbon economy. They have to, they need to have a plan in place for how they're going to transition away. It doesn't really have that much, in my view, to do with offsets other than the transition.
Yeah. Michael, do you give us your take on offsets?
Yeah, I think as we've already alluded to here, there are, for the time being, there are some difficult to decarbonize sectors of the economy where it probably does make sense. Air travel right now, cement production. So, there is a potential role, but we do have to be very careful here about how we do the accounting and what we consider to be a viable offset. And, one of the best examples is actually my experience when I was down there with you in Sydney and others last year. And I experienced the Black Summer along with the people of Australia. Just this horrible climate precipitated disaster, bushfires that blanketed the entire continent. And we saw over the course of several months with those massive bushfires, more carbon go into the atmosphere than Australia had produced through all of the fossil fuel burning it had done for the entire year. In fact, 3 times as much carbon. That should give us pause. If climate change itself is leading to, larger, more extensive wildfires in wildfire-prone regions like California, the Western U.S., Australia, then that really calls into question how reliable that carbon that we think we're burying is. And that's true for other sorts of carbon burial strategies as well, not just natural reforestation and afforestation, but artificial carbon burial, where, the idea is, well, that's one way to get net zero. You start burying carbon. But if that carbon is buried somewhere where there is active tectonics or, there is hydrological flow, there are lots of reasons that containment can become destabilized. And just imagine if we put gigatons and gigatons of carbon down there, and all of a sudden, over the period of a few years, it begins to come back out into the atmosphere. That would give new meaning to the term climate change and global warming. So we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Vanessa, do you see the banks using the offset kind of, good sounds good on paper, we're doing something as a way to kind of postpone or put off action?
That's a trick question because absolutely. The fear is when these announcements were made by banks, many of which have just been made in the last several weeks, no details were provided by banks about how they plan to reach net zero. And without defining net zero, we fear that there is an implicit reliance on these offsets. The question that many people are asking, there's a campaign in the UK, for example, for banks to state the date that they will be fossil fuel free. This is considered a campaign that's too extreme to bring to the United States because it simply is a crazy idea to imagine getting off of fossil fuels. But it is in fact something that can be done and that really has to be a goal for fighting climate change. It doesn't all have to be immediate. We are pragmatists as well, but there is every possibility to stop financing new projects and to phase out existing projects. And since the Paris Agreement was signed, for example, banks knew that they had to start working to reduce their fossil fuel financing. They have instead gone the opposite direction and increased steadily their financing for fossil fuels by $2.7 trillion, although tomorrow there will be a new total release. So offsets are certainly a crutch, I think, as others have said, but also not the solution. So after when you fossil fuel free, can we make a new term like gross zero rather than net zero? Does that work?
It's a good point, because I think net zero is being, while they were playing, of course, the year of 2050 is ridiculous. It's a lovely thought that people would achieve net zero, but how about we aim for 2030 and be realistic about and set the ambition high, which we need. John, there's a question from Jim about as an advisor or for advisors who are looking at climate-focused funds for their clients. How do you differentiate what's real from greenwash?
Well, I think there's a couple of things you can do in looking at funds. I think stewardship is very important. It's sometimes called active ownership. It involves engagement with companies the fund owns shares of around climate risk and other ESG issues, along with a demonstrated willingness to support shareholder proposals on those topics and do things like oppose directors of companies that are not addressing climate and other sustainability issues. So I think that's very important to ask yourself about a fund. Any fund that calls itself climate aware or ESG or sustainability, they should be supporting most key ESG related shareholder proposals, and not all of them do, and not all of them do from the larger fund companies too, the Vanguards, the BlackRock iShares, the Dimensional. So it's good that BlackRock, as the world's largest asset manager, has recently announced a more aggressive voting policy, which is significant. But we'll see. But I think that's very important, the stewardship element of it, because it's a way for investors to have their voice felt, directly at companies. And the thing is, the more companies start to understand, and I think many of them are starting to get this, that their investor base is changing. And it's starting to tilt more towards investors who are concerned about climate. They're concerned about broadly defined sustainability issues. They want to see companies acting more responsibly on a number of different dimensions, not climate. They're starting to change. They're starting to listen more when they are engaged by their investors. They're starting to make changes. There's a lot of folks right at these companies that themselves are, from a generation that is itself concerned about sustainability. There are all kinds of things sort of moving in the same direction towards, hopefully an era of more responsible corporate management of these kinds of issues. And I think investing this way helps. And when you're looking at funds, look at the ones that have the more extensive stewardship programs as a way of differentiating.
That's a really good point. I think that age difference too, as younger people become active in investing, but also in choosing banks, etc. Their demands are quite different than maybe our parents' generation, which kind of just took what they had on offer and didn't push. I guess, Vanessa, a quick question about shareholder activism. My sense in watching climate over the last 15, 20 years is that you can absolutely see almost every trend of where things are going by following what shareholder activists are pushing for, in the climate space. Do you see that having an impact on the banks? And is it, something to watch? And I don't mean, of course, everything, but I mean these kind of large institutional investors, particularly when they involve things like the Uniting Church or, sometimes activist groups that are really focused on the money side of having to move. What I've seen over the last 3 to 4 years in particular is when there are good shareholder activist resolutions brought up, and they get far, or they get a good percentage along, that some work's been done on the ground, and it really can be transformational to push those laggards to do more. Do you see that in the bank space at all, or is it mostly in the kind of more direct into companies?
I see it absolutely being relevant in the banking space, so I'm glad you brought this up. Bank Forward, for example, doesn't necessarily work in that space because there are so many great groups to do.
Yeah.
But just 2 weeks ago, for example, Shareholder Action brought and led HSBC to commit to ending all financing and phasing out financing for coal by 2040. That's a huge win. It's very exposed to coal as well in many parts of Asia, HSBC, and so it's really going to change markets. That was started because of great work by shareholder action groups. We are now on the precipice of annual general meetings for Wall Street banks and more here in the United States. And there are a great number of shareholder actions that have been filed and resolutions that are probably open for voting as of this week. Tomorrow there will be a report shared by Majority Action, which is a group doing this work on the resolutions that they have filed and are watching. So keep an eye on this space. There's already signs that while many banks have made a lot of noise about the climate commitments they are making, their boards are recommending votes against key actions, one of which is the most prominent, I think, is climate risk disclosure, which is being brought to almost all banks and almost passed with JP Morgan with 49 to 51% vote.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So I think out of the session too, it's really important to say to people, watch what happens in shareholder activists on climate, because it is sort of pointing toward where things are going, and it kind of leads you into who's good and who's not, who's laggard and not reacting. Michael, do you think there's a more important role for scientists to play to communicate to the investment sector in particular to help them navigate these huge change that's happening in terms of money flow, but also technology and innovation?
Yeah, well, it's I suppose gratuitous of me to tell this particular anecdote, but I think it was about 5 years ago now. There is an environmental organization in Nebraska that has bought up a substantial number of A shares of Berkshire Hathaway so that they have a speaking opportunity at the annual shareholders meeting. And I and 2 other climate scientists were invited out there to speak to Warren Buffett at the annual shareholders meeting and to support a shareholders a motion that had been put forward asking them to divest of fossil fuel holdings. The motion wasn't successful, and I don't think anybody expected it would be. But it certainly was an opportunity to engage him directly and to actually, in a sense, throw his own words back at him, because he had, in fact, talked about the huge exposure because of climate risk in various investments. And in recent years, he's said at least some better things. So I don't know, maybe that at least helped start to move him in the right direction. And we have to keep on trying.
Absolutely. I think
Not to cut anybody off, but just because you mentioned Berkshire Hathaway, Their voting did open this weekend, and their board did make a recommendation to vote against climate risk disclosure.
Yeah,
So that out there.
Well,
we keep
well,
trying.
yeah, can't hold on to that for long would be my guess. Bring on the COP, because certainly climate risk disclosure is going to be top of the agenda. There's a couple questions from people online with us. Should investors and RIAs be concerned about investing in ESG funds that are run by asset managers that are not pure play ESG and more broadly are invested in or help finance fossil fuels, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, etc.? Probably best to you, John.
Yeah, so I mean, it's tempting to say yes, steer clear of the big asset managers that have ESG funds. I think, you know, it depends on your end investor that you're advising. If there's someone that, you know, really, like a lot of people that buy a mutual fund, it's almost like a kind of consumer choice, right? When they're in the consumer decision-making realm, at times there's a product that I'm buying that I take into account my sustainability concerns in making that decision. If that's the kind of client you have as an advisor, then you know there's going to be a number of ESG funds. The more ESG light versions, I think, are perfectly fine to align with those types of investors. But some are going to be much more adamant that they get a more comprehensive solution. I think you've got to pay attention to your clients there, because I guess my overall point would be, at this point, even additional assets into just general ESG aware type funds that aren't quite as comprehensive as others is a good thing, because it's sending these signals not only to companies, as I mentioned before, that their shareholder base is changing, but to these large asset managers that a growing number of their end investors are concerned about this. And in turn, because they're large asset managers, the impact of their engagement, if they're doing it around ESG, can be even greater because they have more shares to vote across the entire lineup. But again, then it goes back to, does this asset manager have a credible climate-related, ESG-related, sustainability-related stewardship program? They should be reporting on it. They should be telling us if they do. So it's not like it's hidden away somewhere.
And it's worth noting, John, too, if you're involved in this in funds, communicate with them strongly and be loud and proud about your wanting them to look at innovation and move more quickly into climate solutions, et cetera. Because just passively being involved and putting your money in doesn't send as loud. It certainly came out in the divestment campaign.
Especially advisors, especially financial advisors, the sales forces of these asset managers pay attention to their big.
Yeah, they have no power, I think, and that voice is just not heard enough. There's a question from Peter, I think mostly to you, Vanessa. Would the easiest way for banks to de-risk their energy credit portfolios be to use U.S. Treasury through FSOC to declare climate systemic financial risk and require banks to increase their data disclosure, increase capital requirements, and use other regulatory tools since the financial crisis? That's kind of right up your alley, Vanessa. Do you want to take that one?
Well, first, thanks for the question, and clearly somebody who's going to be a wonderful and informed voter. All of the above, is this an option? I mean, I think certainly there's in the conversation now for banks, there's obviously a real need for banks to acknowledge their exposure, and climate risk disclosure is the type of policy that we've seen bandied about the most as a first step. And so I think that is certainly the space to watch for the immediate future with groups like the SEC. However, disclosure is not does not in and of itself mean any sort of progress towards reduction. And so, the type of mandate that we group our policy considerations into is measure, disclose, reduce. And this is where I think reduction types of policies that are interesting to think about are things like increased capital requirements or increased exposure to fossil fuels and to risk. And these, running stress tests on banks will be really interesting, particularly given growing conversations about a price on carbon, and even the relaunch of the social cost of carbon platform by the Biden administration, which is working across agencies to likely raise the currently $50 cost of carbon now. And what will that mean? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. Price on carbon is going to push so much change. We've only got a minute. Can we quickly go around and say, maybe very short and sharp, your one thing you would say for people to watch in interpreting the, what's credible versus what's not? Michael, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, like I said, find some trusted voices, follow them on social media, some of the websites that I've mentioned. And look, if anybody is arguing that we don't have to decarbonize our economy now, that we don't have to move massively in the direction of renewable energy, then you might start to question where they're coming from, because there's a whole lot of noise out there, deflection, distraction, doomism and despair mongering, anything to convince us, to disengage us from the action that is necessary. So look out for these tactics in what I call the new climate war. Not so much denial of climate change, because that's not credible, but other excuses for not doing the obvious thing, for not solving this problem at its source, which is getting off of fossil fuels. It really is that simple at some level.
Yeah, absolutely. Vanessa?
If you go in and express your concerns about your bank's sustainability, they will likely offer you the chance to move your funds or some part of them into their sustainable finance funds and portfolios. And this is a deflection. As long as the bank is still putting the rest of your funds or the rest of your friends' funds and everyone else's into a large percentage of fossil fuels, which it is, you are not contributing to sustainability, and your money is not sustainable. So please watch out for that and ask your bank to change its overall portfolio, not just yours.
Absolutely. Thanks, John.
Well, I mean, I would agree with my colleagues. I mean, you need to seek out two trusted voices in the investment industry, as I talked about before. Look for credible stewardship programs, and pay attention to how they pay attention to what's out there now. Something called impact reports that funds and asset managers have, and you can argue that they're just sort of marketing pieces on the one hand, but on the other hand, if they include, they should be including relevant, actionable information that's useful to investors.
That's great. Thank you all. Really good discussion. We could go on for hours, I'm sure. Thanks for giving your time and answering our good questions, and hope to see you. We'll do it again soon. Thank you.